Hello and welcome to Afternoon Briefing. I'm Greg Jennett.
And I'm Fran Kelly, and we're joining you from Parliament House on Ngunnawal country.
Great to have you back in the nation's capital. Fran, rejuvenated, I hope, by a weekend and ready to power on into the last fortnight.
Yeah, we're in the home stretch now. This Monday brings us into week 5 of this election campaign, and now more than ever, leaders need to be on message and cutting through to voters, Greg, because hundreds of early voting booths, more than 500 actually open today, enabling millions of Australians to cast their ballot before Election Day, Saturday the 21st of May.
Yeah, so knowing they've entered this most important phase of the campaign now, Scott Morrison's been working the New South Wales marginal electorate of Gilmore, while day 29 has taken Anthony Albanese to his old school in Sydney, then on to Adelaide and to Melbourne.
The bells toll for the Morrison government.
Right now today, people are turning up and voting at pre-poll. Over an hour right now, right across the country.
The bells are tolling for the Morrison government because early voting starts today.
It's a choice between Anthony Albanese and his inability to manage money and a weakness or a strength that we have demonstrated on economic policy.
We want people to participate in our democracy and to vote whenever is convenient.
That's why today we're launching our Safe and Secure Australia policy.
Labor has a plan to attract more high achievers into teaching, first of all by offering bursaries.
The way wages rise is unemployment goes down. That's how wages rise.
We will seek to double the number of high achievers teaching over the decade.
And as you heard from Anthony Albanese, he can't make wages go up. Businesses can make wages go up.
Scott Morrison was left with just smears, scares and a smirk. I think we should have 150 Labor members in the House of Representatives. Okay, that's my starting point.
How strong is that shield and will that crumble given inflation is rising?
Our economic shield is proving very effective when you compare what is happening in other countries. Now, you take that shield down with the election of a Labor government and you will feel the same pressures.
Time is up. Have a great day. Study hard and support South.
Sound advice for life, maybe, Fran. Reckon we can reasonably expect the work rate to step up from here. Not that anyone's exactly been coasting for the last 4 weeks, but why don't we take a look back, Fran, at the major set-piece event that launched Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese into this week. That is, of course, the Leaders' Debate on the Nine Network last night. Not exactly a free-for-all, but it did allow a very long leash for the leaders, and they duly snapped and snarled their way through it at times. According to those who persevered with a 9 polling site, it was a hard-fought draw, the numbers concluded. But what do you reckon, Fran? Did it work? Did we actually learn anything?
Oh, no, not much at all, Greg. Really, overall an unedifying display, I thought, by and large, and I did sit and watch it all. The enduring image I have, as I sat there on the couch, is of 2 blokes basically facing each other and shouting at each other. So for any undecided voters out there who tuned in to try and sort of better understand the party offerings, I don't think they would have got very far. It got a little bit narky quite a lot, sort of in the last third of the debate.
Particularly towards the tail end.
Understatement, yeah. I think. And today, Anthony Albanese was blaming the tone, the descent in the tone of it all, on Scott Morrison.
Last night I outlined positive plans for Australia's future. Scott Morrison was left with just smears, scares and a smirk. That's all he's got after 3 terms of government, asking for another 3 years. We can't afford to waste another 3 years. We can't afford 3 more years of the same with a government that won't acknowledge the problems that are there, let alone provide solutions for it. This government thinks that people have got it easy. The truth is that they haven't.
Now, the thing is, he couldn't get those lines out quite that clearly last night because
second time lucky, mate.
They were talking all over each other, so pretty much a waste of time generally. The viewers, as you say, certainly couldn't decide much out of it. The Channel 9 audience rating it a draw. I thought that was probably a bit generous to Scott Morrison, Greg, probably, who landed less of his messages clearly in the hour. And, you know, as I say, the crankiness dialed up. However, that didn't stop the Prime Minister revisiting the debate today, did it?
No, he really wanted to pick up on the wages question, because the question that was specifically put to the Labor leader in the debate, Fran, was, can you guarantee a real wage increase? So 2 components to that. A tough question at the best of times, because apart from public service wages, there really aren't any wages a Prime Minister or any politician has direct control over.
However, that doesn't stop them talking about them and suggesting that they could do better than the other side on that front generally.
Exactly. It's all compare and contrast messaging. Of course, it won't have escaped anyone's attention by now, Fran, that Labor's campaign is heavily built on just that, this idea that it can indirectly contribute to wages growth by lifting productivity, helping to unlock more work hours for families with preschool-aged kids who might need childcare. But it was Anthony Albanese's answer to that question about guaranteed real wage increases that left Scott Morrison apparently feeling that some sort of weakness had been exposed by the debate.
It was a pretty spirited debate. I'm sure everybody will agree. These are passionate topics. This is a big choice. Future of the country, future of our economy, the ability to pay for important services like Medicare, aged care, all of these things. Plenty of people can talk about the problems. The Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese, did a lot of talking about the problems last night, but we didn't hear any solutions. And last night we heard that he can't guarantee wage rises. He's been banging on about this for the last 3 years, talking about how he can boost wages, but when push come to shove and he had to answer the question, can you increase wages? Well, he can't.
They're both trying to re-prosecute their arguments, Greg, because they kept shouting over each other last night.
Yeah, well, at least they got the clear air to do that. And one final point, Fran, in case anyone thinks the day was framed entirely by last night's debate, that wasn't exactly true. Just to specifically tease out what we saw in our quick packaged wrap of the day a little earlier, today wasn't a policy-free zone. The Coalition pledged extra defence equipment spending. This is out of an existing pot of money for defence. And Labor's main promise of the day, there was one in South Australia to do with health, but it went to developing and attracting more high achievers into the teaching.
Yeah, putting real money there actually for, you know, top level students who might put their hand up for teaching. If they do, they'll get a bit of a pay boost from Labor. Yeah,
and I think it in part matches up against something the Coalition also has on the table. So that's the day in policy. Well, as we were just discussing, it was raucous on occasions, but for an election we're told is marked by a complete lack of voter engagement and interest, last night's debate proved strangely compelling to viewers, according to the television ratings figures anyway. More than 600,000 viewers watched it in 5 capital cities and stuck with it too. But can Australia do better with these sorts of events? Well, Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young joins us now from Adelaide. Senator, welcome to Afternoon Briefing. I think you have an answer in the affirmative there, don't you? You've described last night's debate as a farce, a woeful disservice to voters. It can't have been all bad, could it, if that many people stuck with it for an hour plus?
It was excruciating, Greg. Let's be honest. It was excruciating, and perhaps, you know, there were times when you wanted to look away, but you couldn't because you just, you know, were too worried what was going to happen next. But it was, as Fran identified at the top of the show there, you know, for many of us watching, 2 blokes shouting at each other and not really actually debating the big issues that we know as Australians we face right now, whether that's the climate crisis, whether it's the inequality crisis, whether it's how we help make workplaces safer and more secure for low-income workers and particularly women. And right across the board, I thought there was a void of real policy discussion and debate. The shouting might make people think they've got good ratings, but it doesn't do well to service the informed voter. And I think that's the problem here. And of course, I couldn't come on this show, Greg, and not be upfront about the fact that I think it is a damn shame that the ABC hasn't been able to host one of these election debates this election. I think a national election debate of our national leaders should be broadcast on our national broadcaster, and that, of course, is the ABC.
Well, you're entirely okay to prosecute that here. I won't go into that because I'm really drawn to the actual solution or idea, I suppose, that you are prosecuting and have from the get-go today, Sarah Hanson-Young. Now, in the next Parliament, you're proposing to use some sort of mechanism to establish an independent debates commission. What is that? Is that a bill or a motion? And then how does the commission work?
Well, I think it would have to be a piece of legislation in the first instance that would allow for the establishment of an independent debates commission. Now, you know, who's on that and how that board or commission is selected is up for discussion. But it's really to get this out of the hands of political parties and politicians on the eve of an election. Look, other countries do this. They have independently agreed, monitored and implemented debates for their elections. And I think it's time that we have something similar here. Australia has a really proud history of having an independent electoral commission. We should be extending that now to a debate so that it's not left to the faceless men or women in the political parties, or indeed the chief of staffs of leaders, to thrash out what they think is going to suit their boss best.
Right. Well, as you say, there are different...
I'm more interested in putting the public interest of these debates front and centre.
Well, as you say, there are different models around the world. I note that the US Commission on Presidential Debates is actually just or was until very recently, I think there's been a bit of a kerfuffle there, a bipartisan project run by Republicans and Democrats. So who in your model would be the stakeholders, if you like, on this commission? Would the major parties have, quote unquote, skin in the game on that commission?
I think they, of course, would have to be consulted, but I don't think it should be the major parties who get to sit and their representatives on the commission and dictate. I mean, there are so many issues in this election that are missing out in being discussed because they're not being prosecuted by the major parties. I'd argue that in a fully fair debate of leaders, that you'd have the leader of the Greens at the front of right there on the stage debating as well.
Is that your primary motivation behind all of this?
No, my primary motivation is making sure that the public get access to the views, the ideas and that insight into what the democracy can deliver for them. And last night there was a void of real solutions being put forward because it was more about the egos of the two men on stage.
But no organisational body or architecture around it can guarantee you quality in questions or breadth of coverage if that's what you're after. I mean, are you suggesting such commissions do that in any other country?
Look, what I'm suggesting is the way it is at the moment is a farce, and we saw that last night. There must be a better solution, and at least taking it out of the hands of the political parties and putting it, having the rules set well before elections, an agreement that it is broadcast on the national broadcaster, that it is, the rules are already set, would at least take out some of that day-to-day heated politics that happens on the campaign trail.
And of course, it's always been a feature, or at least it has for the last 10 or 15 years, this debate over debates. How many are we going to have? When are we going to have them? Who's showing up? Who's not? Nothing under your model, I know it's only the rough outlines of one at the moment, but could it, a political leader, Prime Minister, opposition leader, to front at any given event?
No, of course, it would be up to them, but it'd be a pretty bad look, wouldn't it, Greg, if you had a debate hosted by the national broadcaster and the ABC, and the Prime Minister of the day, or the person who wants to be the Prime Minister on the day after the election, didn't show up. I think that says everything to voters. And I guess when you've got a Prime Minister currently who's snubbed the ABC right now, there isn't a debate that's going to be had. I'd urge him, I'd urge Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese today, you know what, there's 2 weeks left of this campaign, perhaps agree to do something with the ABC. And I don't know whether it's Fran Kelly or Laura Tingle. I'd love to see one of these strong female journalists moderating a proper debate.
All right. Well, look, it's an interesting proposal, nevertheless. So we'll see where you get to. Perhaps even it finds greater traction in hung parliament. Just finally, as a South Australian senator, the campaign's well and truly underway. Voting started today. Sarah Hanson-Young, you're not up for re-election. Are we likely to witness the return of your old sparring partner in Nick Xenophon, do you think, in your home state?
Well, the polls opened today, of course, and I must say I was there bright and early this morning with our Senate candidate, Barbara Pocock, and there was a lot of people taking the Greens how to vote cards, and I didn't see anyone taking anything from the old Nick Xenophon.
Okay.
But look, this is about the need for change so that we can save the planet and deal with this climate crisis. And people know we've got no more time to waste here. This is the election to get serious about tackling the climate crisis. And in our state, you've got an opportunity to elect another strong woman to the Senate, a progressive woman, a Green woman, and I can't wait to have Barbara Pocock sitting next to me on the red benches.
Somehow I expected you to say that. We might have to get Nick Xenophon to speak to his own fortunes with us on another occasion. But Sarah Hanson-Young, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg.
Well, with 2 weeks to go and pre-polling underway, the election's entered its perhaps most critical phase. Last night's debate, let's call it that for now, between the two leaders didn't produce an outright winner, with another debate scheduled for Thursday. I'm joined now by our regular panel of political experts, former Labor Minister Craig Emerson and former Liberal Minister Christopher Pyne. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Fran.
Let's start
nice to be here.
Yes, lovely to have you both there. Let's start with last night's debate. Shouty McShouty is the general verdict. What did you get from it? What do you think anyone got from it? Christopher?
Look, I think both leaders are trying to get the attention of the electorate. It's been a very unusual campaign. Anthony Albanese's had a rocky few weeks of, I assume people would say, gaffe-prone. And Scott Morrison is trying to shift the debate to the risks of Labor, to economic policy, national security, and away from what's been a messy last 12 months. So both of them are trying to move the debate to a different place after 4 weeks. And I think it's fair to say there are a lot of undecided voters. There are a lot of soft voters. People aren't sure how they're going to finally fall. And I think the two leaders are trying to get the advantage over the other one in these last 2 weeks. And I think that came out in the debate. There was a sense of wanting to dominate and control the debate, and that's why they were a bit talking over each other. And I'm not sure it really moved the dial very much one way or the other.
No, I'm not sure it would have either. Craig, what did you think? Do you think the any undecided voters tuning in, trying to get a bit of a sense of things, would have got much out of it at all?
I reckon a lot of them would have gone to bed. Settle down, you two. I mean, it was a shout-a-thon, and look, the format itself was a problem. You can't really say on a policy issue, I'll give each leader 1 minute to answer a question. I did think that Scott Morrison was trying to unsettle Anthony Albanese whenever he did speak and was asked to speak. Mr Morrison interrupted and talked over the top of him. And then, of course, Anthony didn't want that to be one-way traffic, so he did a bit of that himself. And I think probably the undecided voters were none the wiser.
Channel 9...
Bad format and poorly implemented. I don't take any pleasure out of saying that, but a bad format and poorly implemented and terrible technical problems. You know, people were trying to vote and they couldn't. And if you on the screen there were 3 buttons. You could vote for the Coalition or Labor or the Coalition, and I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, that wasn't a good moment. I had a look at that myself. The Channel 9 panel was saying afterwards they were a bit surprised that the interaction between the two leaders got so animated that, you know, and that they were reading into that perhaps this is gloves off time to try and get those undecideds to take notice. Is that how you saw it, Christopher? Is that the dynamic you were talking about?
Well, I think the national opinion polls are showing that the Coalition is losing and that Labor are favourites. And I think I've been saying that for 4 weeks, that Labor are definitely favourites to win. What is interesting, though, is that the polling seat by seat and state by state is quite different. And if you speak to Labor people, and I speak to Labor people sometimes, they'll tell you that, you know, they're quite nervous about the election because of the seat by seat polling. And I think that's why there's a level of animation in the debate last night. I also agree with Craig that the format was poor. I mean, you can't expect politicians to answer a question in 1 minute about a serious policy issue. I know it sounds, you know, like fun to force the pollies into 1 minute answers so they never stop talking, but it's a bit of an urban myth that pollies will talk endlessly. But you can't answer serious policy issues in 1 minute. And I think that created a sense of tension, which was unnecessary. There should have been at least 3 minutes to answer policy questions with a 1 minute or rebuttal from the other side. And then you wouldn't have had the need for people to be interrupting each other.
Craig, people have started turning up the pre-polling stations from today. They've got 2 weeks. Last election, 4.7 million votes were posted at those pre-polling stations. We expect, the AEC expects it'll be, even though it's only a 2-week period, not 3, they expect to match that at least. So there's a fair turnout today at some of them. Would you expect the leaders to become even more shrill now as they're trying to get the messages through at this moment, just as that many millions of people are starting to cast their votes?
Yeah, I'm trying to be analytical here, and I'm also agreeing with Christopher. Because the Coalition is behind in the polls, it's got to sort of try to jolt things loose and have people rethink what they are obviously thinking of doing, and that is voting in a Labor government. So when I saw Scott Morrison constantly interrupting after 5 or 10 seconds and shouting over the top of Anthony Albanese, I didn't think it was inexplicable. I thought he was trying to get Anthony to, be narky and fight back and so on. And what I'm getting at is to dislodge the perceptions that are, I think, as if the polls are roughly right, are becoming locked in. And so this last 2 weeks, you'll probably see more of that. From the Coalition's point of view, there'll be much more talking about the horrible, unimaginable risk if a Labor government was formed. You'd hope they'd have something more to say than that, but I think they probably won't. And so what Anthony Albanese and his team will do is continue to roll out what we called in the review signature policies, not wildly expensive ones, but signature policies to signify the direction of an Albanese Labor government to make some really positive changes.
Christopher, that risk message from Scott Morrison, he really stepped that up. I mean, it's been his message right from the get-go, but he really stepped it up last week when the interest rate rise came up. He's very articulate in it. It carries a lot of force. But here we get the news poll this week, today, and it shows a drop in the primary vote for the Liberal Party. Do you think that drop is directly related to the interest rate rise? Is that what you see as behind that drop?
I think the drop is related to the inflation increase followed by the interest rate rise. Those 2 weeks were negative for the government. The first 2 weeks were good for the government, and the inflation rise and then the interest rate rise has shaken people's confidence in the economic management credentials of the government. And sure, the government's position is that there are international matters at hand, which is true, the war in Ukraine, the coronavirus, and we've handled it better than most nations. But that is cold comfort to people in terms of their cost of living increases. Yes, they recognise that there are factors outside the government's control, but that doesn't make them happy. and at election time they've got one vote every 3 years, and it's their chance to say we're not happy. And that's why governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them, because people say we've had enough, we want to change and see if the other side can do better. After 9 years of coalition government, that is magnified. So, of course, Labor is favourite to win. And so Scott Morrison has to say to people, well, last time you thought that, you got the Gillard and the Rudd governments, and you weren't happy with those after 6 years, and you changed again. In fact, you could arguably say in 2010 they went into minority government, so people just showed their displeasure. So he's trying to say to people, don't make that mistake again because you'll regret it. It's a perfectly justifiable position to adopt, and it, in many cases it does work.
Yeah, and it's a dangerous message for Labor, Craig. We've talked about that before in the past. Is this a dangerous moment for an opposition when the published polls are showing they're ahead, they're staying ahead, the question that says who do you think will win shows Labor will win? Is that dangerous in perception terms?
No, I think quite the opposite, and that is the elusive goal during election campaigns is momentum, and you really want to, in a sense, generate a level of interest and excitement to say, yeah, we're going to do this. And so I don't think Labor will be saying, oh, I hope Scott Morrison doesn't beat up on us. They'll be saying, come on, let's have a good go here. And those policies that Labor is announcing are well thought out. They're good actual policies, but they're also very appealing, such as the childcare policy, making sure people in aged care facilities get proper meals and actually have a nurse there. The training programs, the climate change programs, they're good policies. People do find them attractive. But the one thing I just should mention while we're still talking about the debate, Fran, what I don't understand is that Scott Morrison is campaigning in the outer urban and regional areas, and his messages are for the outer urban and regional areas. You can see where he's travelling and so on. What about the Liberals in what were safe Liberal seats, such as Wentworth and North Sydney, Goldstein and even Kooyong, Josh Frydenberg's seat? Nothing last night that Scott Morrison said was in any way appealing to any of those. And it's almost as if he said, well, I'm willing to sacrifice them if I can pick up some offsetting seats, and then maybe we'll talk to the independents if it happens to be a hung parliament. But if I were one of those members of parliament in a formerly safe Liberal seat, I'd be pretty annoyed with Scott Morrison for basically abandoning him.
Well, Christopher, let me ask you about that, because 5 years ago I couldn't help but remember you famously declared that the moderates were back in the winner's circle. Things have changed a lot since then. You left, Julie Bishop left, George Brandis left, of course Malcolm Turnbull left. It's a very different Liberal government now. But the Prime Minister out again on the weekend reaffirming he'll introduce a religious discrimination bill, but not the part of the bill that would act as the protection for LGBT students. I mean, Craig Emerson's right. He's not only is he making things difficult for those moderates, he's actually giving them real grief, it would seem. What's going on?
Well, Fran, I always feel like I'm in the winner's circle, especially on afternoon briefing with the ABC.
That a boy.
Look, the truth is Scott Morrison is not trying to damage any of his colleagues. He obviously hasn't given up on any seats, and he would know that he needs Kooyong and Wentworth and North Sydney and Goldstein to form a government. And, of course, as I wrote today in a News Corporation newspaper, if any of those Teal independents, so-called, get elected, they'll all support a Labor government. Make no mistake about it. So anybody in any of those seats who's thinking of voting for an independent has to understand they're voting for someone who'll support Labor in office.
But what's he doing? What's Scott Morrison doing? Because he's not helping Josh Frydenberg try and hang on to Kooyong with this kind of intervention on the religious discrimination bill and on the national integrity issue, is he?
Well, I think, if you take Josh Frydenberg and Kooyong and Goldstein, I think a lot of people in those electorates do support a religious discrimination bill. Now, what the actual final terms of that remain to be seen, but it was a government policy in the 2019 election. They tried to implement it It was thwarted by Labor.
But Christopher, that's not the whole story. I'm sure you're aware that the policy and the promise from the Prime Minister was that they wouldn't allow discrimination against gay students. Yeah. Now the government's not going to bring in the change to the Sex Discrimination Act at the same time. The Prime Minister says, you know, it's not an issue anyway. These private schools and these Christian schools and Catholic schools aren't discriminating against gay students. So it is a change.
Well, look, I've never been a great believer in codifying rights like this, Fran. So whether it's religious discrimination or sexual discrimination and so forth, I never supported a Bill of Rights because I think that most of the laws organically grow, especially if they are interpreted by the courts. So I've never been a great believer in having a bill that apparently codifies rights because often I think you find that you limit them as opposed to allow them to organically grow.
The five moderates who crossed the floor at 5:20 a.m. did so for a very clear reason, and that is, I think in the case of some of them, a belief that that legislation should be defeated, and in the case of others, that this was going to cost them in their electorate. So it is a live issue, and Scott Morrison has today or yesterday said you're on your own on this. So he's not going to put the bill back into Parliament if he wins the election that had them in a situation where they're saying we have to stand up for these kids, for LGBTIQ kids. Well, we'll know. And that's where we are.
In 2 weeks' time, we'll know how this is playing out. Gentlemen, see you again next week. I look forward to it. Thank you so much for your company.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Fran. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Chris. Okay.
No worries.
All right, well, so many politicians have been sidelined for a week or so with COVID infections during this campaign. If they were lucky, some of them, it might have come early, but independent candidate for North Sydney, Kylie Tink, wasn't quite so fortunate. She's still in isolation and joins us now. Kylie Tink, thanks for, overcoming whatever illness prevails. Where are you up to on that isolation, just briefly?
Yeah, I've got 48 hours to go and then we'll be back out on Wednesday this week. So, all right. Yeah, just coming to the end.
Yeah, so early voting, of course, has started today. For independents of all persuasion in recent campaigns, I suppose the mechanics of campaigning has been a bit of a weakness. I think the AEC website lists about 8 early polling places linked to North Sydney. Where are you at? Have you got your volunteers out there at any or all of those pre-poll centres?
Yeah, actually, our campaign is incredibly well organised. We were fortunate enough, we announced that we'd be running an independent in the seat of North Sydney back in September last year. So we have nearly 1,000 people have signed up to be active volunteers for our campaign. So we've been able to man all of the pre-polls today and we'll continue to man the polls right through until after they close at the end of 21st of May. That
makes you, according to John Howard, that makes you, and I suppose by association, your supporters, quote, anti-Liberal groupies. What was your response when the former Prime Minister derided Teal independence in this manner last week?
Look, I think what's very clear is that when you have a system that is working really well between the two major parties, neither of them are going to have a vested interest for seeing any change brought into that system. And I think what's really interesting is to hear comments like that coming from a former Prime Minister who, you know, I'm sure during his time as Prime Minister prided himself in his capacity to listen to the community and work to develop forward-facing legislative reform. The reality is there is no Teal movement. In fact, my campaign has always been pink, just as I know Helen Haynes's has always been orange. Sure. This is the rise of a new way of doing politics, and it's being driven by communities that are frustrated and quite simply don't want to put up with the poor political behaviour that we've seen emerging over the last decade and the lack of advancement for our country.
All right, why don't I take you through some of your policies, Kylie Tink? We may not get a chance to do it with under 2 weeks remaining. So emissions cuts of at least 60% by 2030, I think is your baseline policy position there. By what mechanism do you think this needs to be driven? Obviously, the government and Labor have this safeguards mechanism. Is that up to the job? Do you think you can negotiate the numbers you want using that?
Look, I think what's important from my perspective is I'll be backing the climate bills that were previously tabled by Zali Steggall. Those bills were developed in reference to what's been going on in the UK since 2008. So the UK Climate Act was brought in then. And what it did was enable a framework to be established so that the political side of government can change, but the direction that we're taking on climate doesn't stall. So
but
I
of
think
course, we've had these debates in Australia about whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's a cap and trade, emissions trading scheme. I mean, there's all sorts of mechanisms that can be used. I'm just wondering whether you have a preferred model, because let's face it, this is a ambitious cut in a short period of time. Government need to have these, I know it might seem dull or arcane to some, but they need these mechanisms to drive it.
Look, and I think that sort of mechanism is exactly what would be recommended by the Climate Change Commission, which is fundamental to Zali's bills. So we need to stop politicising climate change and start to talk and look to scientists and facts for what we have to do. So I'd be going into this with the ambition to create a framework that can hold our government to account and then listen to the experts to be able to set realistic targets for ourselves to drive forward.
Okay. No new coal or gas extraction projects is one of your positions. What should happen, though, to coal exports from this country?
Yeah, look, we need to phase out our reliance on fossil fuels. So I'm not suggesting that we would stop overnight, but the reality is that the market for coal and gas will diminish over time, and it's important that we front foot that transition. So
over what sort of period of time do you think?
Well, I've argued that there should be that 60% reduction by 2030 and then to get to net zero by 2040. Again, I'll be coming back to the experts and looking for guidance on them. I grew up in rural and regional Australia, so I know how resilient communities can be and how quickly they can transition. What we need is leadership at the national level to help those communities find their way forward and to make sure we prioritise that fair and equitable transition.
But if we were phasing, just one last one on coal exports, if we were phasing out coal exports, would a decade seem reasonable to you?
I would have to wait and hear what the economists and the experts have to say on that. But the reality is we need to be moving faster to a sustainable and renewable future and looking to value add for those things that we can do here on shore. So I think the most important thing that a politician can do is represent their community and keep their ears open to understand what we hear from science and experts. And that would be my job as North Sydney's independent.
Okay, and one transparency question, which I think we've asked all the high-profile independents, where your figure is up to. Are you actually disclosing that? Most of the other Teal independents have.
Yeah, look, I'm not a Teal independent.
I accept
community
that.
Independent running for the seat of North Sydney. Yeah, but I've been very upfront from the beginning in terms of how our fundraising's going. So we're incredibly excited. We're up to about 1.2 now, with the majority of that money having been raised from the community and the most common gift being $100.
And Climate 200's component being?
Yeah, just over 35, nearly 40% now.
Okay. Kylie Tink, we wish you well on the campaign trail when you're eventually freed from isolation there for the last run to the line on the 21st of May. Thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
I appreciate it. See you.
Well, less than 2 weeks out from election day, are either of the major parties offering the right policies on the right scale to make real change to the lives and futures of Australian women? I'm joined now by Sam Mostyn, President of the Advocacy Group Chief Executive Women, Danielle Wood, CEO of the Grattan Institute, and Hayley Foster, CEO of the Trauma Victim Support Organisation Full Stop Australia. Thank you all of you for joining me.
Lovely to be here.
Let's do a very quick round the grounds with all of you. Can I get you to each of you give me your number one priority for something that needs to change at this election for the major parties? Sam, let's start with you.
Well, one of our number one policy advocacy points is universal early childhood education and care. We know that it is one of the policies that most releases women back into the economy, not just women, families and men as well. We know it has a triple dividend, that not only does it deal with one of the chronic cost of living issues for families, but it also addresses something people don't think about, which is that 20% of children in Australia start school with at least one cognitive deficit, and that early childhood education and care is a huge contributor to fixing that. It's one of a raft of big policy things, but that's the big one for us to see some real strength in.
Danielle?
Look, I'm going to have to agree with Sam, and from an economic lens, it is an incredibly important policy. We have a lot of women in this country that would like to work more, but are not able to because of the high out-of-pocket costs of childcare. So making childcare, early learning and care more affordable is actually a really big policy levers that governments have, both to increase workforce participation and in the long run to increase productivity by unleashing that sort of group of talented women into the workforce, but also through those longer term benefits that Sam just touched on.
Okay.
Improving education and childhood development is also a really important long term productivity measure.
Okay, I'll come back to the issue of childcare in a moment, but Hayley, your number one priority?
Well, look, I won't argue with the economic argument, but we're at the pointy end of things, and I would absolutely say that we need a $1 billion per annum investment in the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and their Children. We absolutely need to see an injection of funding for housing, but we also need to make sure that people who've experienced sexual, domestic and family violence have access to the services that they need to be safe and to recover after the crisis.
All right, let's stay there with you on that issue, Hayley. It's hard to see why we're not talking more about violence against women in this country, given the intransigent statistic and the horrific statistic that one woman on average murdered every week in this country, and this year is no different to last year, which was no different to the year before. I'm not hearing much about it, Hayley. Are we hearing anything close to what you say is needed there?
Well, no. Look, we're really encouraged that there's been an increase in funding and investment in this area, but it should be a top priority, and we're not hearing anything about it through the election, which is absolutely quite a shock. After the reckoning that we've had, we would assume that this would be front of mind and in the news every day. Unfortunately, it feels that particularly sexual violence victims, but domestic violence victims as well, are being forgotten.
Let me stay with you on this because we have heard a little bit. Labor has pledged, I'll just get the statistic, for emergency housing for women and children escaping violence, $1.6 billion to build 4,000 new social housing properties specifically for women and children fleeing violence, and $100 million for crisis accommodation. Is that in the order of what's needed? Anything close?
Look, of course, we're going to say it's great to see an increased investment, but it is not in the order of what we need. We know from Equity Economics have done the modelling that we need $7.6 billion over the next term of government to just actually deal with the current crisis. That would build 16,800 homes, which is what's needed immediately, and that does not even count. That's the women who are turning up to crisis shelters. That's not even counting them, hundreds of thousands of women who are in unsafe situations at home right now who can't escape because they don't have an affordable housing option.
Sam Mostyn, you, I think, chair, or certainly on the panel of ANMROs, the Morrison government issued a major statement in the budget just this year, a women's economic security statement, bringing their commitment to $5.5 billion in this space over the last 2 years, $1.3 billion in the last budget. Is that of the order that Hayley says we need, that we do need to make a real change?
Look, I agree, Fran, with Hayley and Danielle. The expenditure we need has got to be in the same form as the kind of long-term investment we make in physical infrastructure. So what we're talking about here is an investment in the long-term infrastructure that supports women in our economy. And it's whether it's safety in the national plan, early childhood education and care, a real investigation into the care industries and the appalling rates in which women are paid, or women's presence generally in policy making to see that we are investing in the right things, paid parental leave with superannuation. All of those things add up to what should be a very big amount of money, but seen through the lens that we see every infrastructure project, which is social infrastructure for the long term with really significant paybacks. And if you think about the Productivity Commission today says in its reports that there are 80,000 people in the country today who would like secure, good work, who can't do that at the moment because they can't get childcare. It's neither affordable nor available. And then we have women who are working in the care sector, holding up the economy as they did through COVID, who are either subject to much of what Hayley described as sexual harassment, sexual assault and worse, who don't have the support they need. They're holding up our economy in low-paid jobs, often running families, and we just don't pay them the attention we need to as part of the economic vibrancy of the future. And we know the big policies that can lift women should be front and centre in this election campaign and the stories we're hearing. But for some reason, the political process is not identifying women as an essential part of our economic future.
But Sam, what would one of those policies, we can't go into too much detail tonight, obviously, in the time we have, but what would one of those policies look like? Because, you know, the budget before last, of course, the Prime Minister and the Minister for a number of female ministers said, well, women, you know, drive on roads as well. I mean, what would a policy look like that you're talking about that would be of the scale and focus for change?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I think Labor should be credited with their announcements about the way in which they would legislate to have gender equity at the centre of the Fair Work Act and the work of the Fair Work Commission. That alone, that single matter, and industrial relations and employment lawyers have said across the country, that thing alone allows for the Commission to look deeply at the pay disparity between men and women in this country in very significant ways. So that's a very good structural piece of work that I think we should applaud. It could change the way in which we think about a number of these sectors. But an investment or a commitment to universal, high-quality early education and care for children is one of the big policy levers. It's very easy to do. It would require Commonwealth and state relations, but it means a commitment to understanding what kind of a lever it is that releases women and families back into the economy and deals with that education piece. But paid parental leave schemes, changing the culture of who actually takes leave, encouraging men to be more flexible. You know, there are a range of things that if you put them into one package, Fran, do work very effectively, because we have the most highly educated population of women in the world, in this country, and we sit 70th on the World Economic Forum's list of women's workforce participation and progress. That's just a complete waste of an available resource.
Danielle, let's go to the issue of childcare, because Labor, it's Labor's centrepiece policy. It's the single biggest investment in this election campaign, more than $5 billion, but that's over 5 years. The government, though, the coalition did lift spending on childcare. They introduced a childcare reform within the last 2 years, valued something like $1.7 billion. I mean, are these changes the right changes? And is the issue they're just not sort of enough investment? How do you rate those in terms of changing the dial to where it needs to be to get that kind of breakthrough change and improvement for women and children that you were talking about?
Look, certainly both changes were welcome. So the coalition's change was a much more targeted package. 1.7 billion was over 3 years, was really about trying to bring down costs for families with 2 or more children in care, which is when it can get really expensive. So look, we found that's a step in the right direction, is improving incentives to work, making it a bit more affordable. Labor's policy is more substantial. It goes further. It will make a much more significant difference to people's out-of-pocket costs. But really important is part of the Labor policy is a transition to universal low-cost or free care. So they've very clearly signalled that they are working towards that. That's not something you can do overnight. Frankly, it will be a big change, and it will require an expansion of the sector. Obviously, if care is low cost or free for everyone, there are going to be more people using it. That's the whole purpose of the policy. So it needs to be sort of implemented over time. So I think what they are doing makes a lot of sense as a sensible transition step to that policy.
Danielle, can you explain, because I have a lot of trouble often decoding childcare policies, can you explain the difference that Labor's $5 billion policy over 3 years would make for families with a couple of kids in daycare?
Yes, so the biggest impact Labor's policy will have is for people with 1 child in care. So essentially going to match the coalition's policy for 2 or more children in care. If you've got 1 child in daycare, both parents on, $80,000 a year full-time equivalent, mum working 3 days a week, dad full-time, it's about $2,500. But really importantly, what it does is shift incentives to add additional days. So if you want to go from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5, you're going to be taking home a lot more additional pay for that extra day compared to under the status quo. So it's a cost of living measure, but really importantly, it's a workforce incentive measure.
And just to stay with you for one moment on this, because I think you've done the maths on it, the universal early childhood commitment you're talking about, what amount of money would be required to fund that, and how do the sums work out? Because it's always put in the box of a productivity measure. So how do those sums balance?
Look, so we estimate it's about $12 billion. Others will do different costings, but I think it's probably somewhere in that ballpark. Our numbers show just on the participation effects alone, by actually creating that incentive for particularly women to increase their hours, it's sort of a 2-to-1 economic benefit. So the increase to GDP is about $25 billion a year. So if, as Sam said, if we thought about it in the same way we think about physical infrastructure, when things have that kind of benefit cost ratio, we invest in them because it's about boosting the productive capacity of the economy. And frankly, it kind of sails over most of the ratios we see in infrastructure investment.
And Hayley, as you said, there's so many priorities required for change and improvement in women's lives. But do you see the connection between investment in those economic policies, investment in things like, getting the Fair Work Commission to examine the impact on women of all these decisions and parity at something like the Commission, and the impact of that on violence against women and children?
Oh, 100%. There is an inextricable link between women's economic security and women's safety. If we don't tilt the balance and make it more equal, then relationships aren't equal. And at the end of the day, sexual and domestic and family violence is about an abuse of that power differential. So absolutely, if we want generational change and we want to end violence against women, we have to address women's economic security 100%. But we cannot forget those that are in violent situations right now. And I can't stress this enough. 1 in 3 people who contact our sexual violence and domestic violence helplines can't get through. That's, sexual and domestic violence services are not a luxury. They're an essential service, and we must make sure that we're funding them. We can't have, as politicians, standing up their hand on heart saying that they support sexual violence survivors, that they're absolutely, they're in shock over what they've been through, and say that they'll do whatever they can to support them. And at the other side of the coin say, no, but we're not going to make sure that, when you need support at 2 o'clock in the morning, no one's there for you.
So what do you need then, Hayley? There's 2 weeks left in this election campaign. What do you need? What do you think the groups supporting women require to be able to have enough money, enough hands on deck, enough capacity to pick up every one of those phone calls, to find emergency housing for every one of those women and their kids? What's needed, and what do you hope to hear in the next 10 days?
It's really easy. There's already money allocated under the National Partnership Agreement on family, domestic and sexual violence. Let's make sure we release some of those services, that funding, to sexual violence services. Let's commit in the first year of this next parliament to look at a mapping and make sure that we're filling those gaps and those shortfalls across the country. And finally, let's just commit to working with the states and territories to addressing those gaps once and for all. It's not okay to say, yes, we're aware there are gaps, but we're not going to fill them. We don't have a plan.
But Sam Mostyn,
we need a plan, and we need people to stand up and make that commitment now.
Sorry, Hayley. Sam Mostyn, isn't that what the National Action Plan is supposed to be doing? Filling those gaps, identify where the gaps are, and then fill them? Isn't the funding envelope there for it?
It is in a way. Hayley is absolutely right. There is a commitment to money and there is a plan, but there's not a lot of transparency about when the money flows and for what purposes. And Hayley and the women who support Hayley at the front line of this terrible, terrible tragedy that occurs every day and night in Australia are right to be concerned about where that money goes. But if I try to link a few things, Fran, I think what we're all trying to say is what should be front and centre of our thoughts and that leaders should be considering is respect for women and girls across this country. Everything you're hearing is about policies and processes that either hold us back economically, leave us in dangerous and vulnerable situations with sexual violence, in workplaces that Kate Jenkins, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, found were unsafe. And her 55 recommendations are an easy thing for every leader to say, we absolutely commit to those full recommendations, including a positive duty on all employers to provide safe workplaces for women free of harassment and assault.
Do we have that commitment from both parties?
No, we've got it from Labor, but not from the Coalition. The Coalition did try to do some things around paid parental leave and superannuation and trying to encourage more men to take that up in the last budget, but it was directionally sort of going okay, but it wasn't near enough, not a big enough scheme and didn't have superannuation attached. So all these things to me say, if we respected the role of women in the Australian society, economy and community in the way we did when we asked them all to be clapped and cheered when we got through COVID, we'd actually have a series of policies that would elevate women, just as we have for men, to be active, productive parts of our economy and hold our communities together. And it would be a safer, better place. And they're not big numbers relative to the release of economic activity. I know Danielle gave you one, but if we just halved the participation rate between men and women in the Australian economy today. That's $60 billion to GDP annually from about the 2030s.
Okay.
These are very efficient policies.
We have 1 minute left, and I'm going to give it to Danielle because I'm hoping you've done this number, Danielle, but I haven't checked. But if we could absolutely close the gender pay gap, the government boasts that it's gone from 17-point-something% under them to 13.8% today. How long do you think on that trajectory till it closes, and what would that be worth to women's wealth? Briefly, if you can.
I have not done that number, but I believe it's something in the vicinity of 50 years. It is taking too long. Occupational segregation and low pay in the care economy, which we've touched on, is an important 20 to 25% of that gap. So doing something on that will make a difference. Time out to care for children, which is often spent more than people would like to because of the cost of childcare, will help close that gap. And gender discrimination actually is also an important part of the gap. But I think these policies looked at holistically hopefully starts to lead to the cultural change, which will also speed that process up, because 50 years is too long to wait.
Okay, well, a bit of disappointment. We're not seeing more of those numbers and more of that urgency right now yet. There's still 2 weeks to go. Sam Mostyn, Danielle Wood and Hayley Foster, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Fran.
All right, interesting chat, Fran. Now, who says that this is a policy-free election? Because as that conversation demonstrates, the big ideas are all out there. It's just that they're not always ventilated through the two-party leader-focused.
Well, the ideas are there, but are the major parties putting them front and centre and putting their money where their mouth is in this election campaign? There's plenty of money being spent, Greg, through the pandemic. Sure. We've got $1 trillion worth of debt, or getting close to it, but some of these big issues have not been the focus, and I think you could sense the frustration there, particularly from Hayley Foster, about women are dying. I mean, women and children are suffering violence and abuse every day, every night, and there just doesn't seem to be quite the effort to close that gap.
Yeah, well, look, that came through loud and clear. Why don't we round out, Fran, just where we started today, looking back at the debate. There's another one still to come on Wednesday, and you've been around for a while. The idea of a standing body that might organise these things and improve them. Debates Commission is the phrase that Sarah Hanson-Young is using and proposing to legislate if she gets a chance in the next parliament. Not exactly new, never takes off.
Not exactly new. In fact, I could have sworn there was a committee set up and there was even recommendation, I think,
the
from
press
the government.
gallery right here tried it.
Yeah, that's right, and Labor didn't pick it up. I'm not sure of the details of why they didn't, but look, it's obvious every time we have this, it's a farce, it's a debacle, it's a waste of our time and effort. There's much more important things to be focusing on and talking about in an election campain. We should just deal with it, get it set, and then it wouldn't be an issue.
Well, that is a challenge. It is possibly a challenge for the next parliament. At least Sarah Hanson-Young reckons she's going to have a crack. Anyway, that's about it from us today. Fran, why don't we wrap up at that point? And thank you for watching Afternoon Briefing. We'll be back at the same time again tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.